It's already a tough life for failed decks and archetypes. Do you know what makes it worse? Being hyped by the community as good and then realizing you're a failure. Dark Magicians, Ignites, Magical Musketeers, and Pure Subterrors were all victims of the hype trains that got derailed by reality. It's even more terrible when Konami gets too excited about an archetype as they did with Amorphages, a pendulum deck that was just pure floodgates that turn off your opponent's cards. Who wouldn't think of it as a meta contender? It's too bad we didn't finish the fine print that said this deck isn't worth the paper it's printed on. Not only did this deck do nothing to meta, but it's also recognized as one of the worst pendulum decks to be created. With heavy maintenance costs and a strict build that barely allows any text, this archetype exited the Yu-Gi-Oh community as fast as it came into it. So today we'll capitalize on the Amorphage's player's misfortune and explain why this archetype belongs in the Hall of Fail. The Amorphage wave happened in 2016 in Shining Victories. The brood of Floodgate Earth Dragons varies from levels 2 to level 8. And no matter which one is on the field, they all have a continuous effect that prevents players from special summoning from the extra deck except for Amorphage monsters while they're face up on the field when pendulum summoned or flip face up. However, Goliath and Sloth don't need to be pendulum summoned to activate their continuous effect and just need to be summoned. During your standby phase, you have an upkeep that requires you to tribute a monster or destroy them when they're in the pendulum zones. The archetype has 11 cards to their name. 12 if you count a specific ritual monster, which doesn't seem like much. Still, when you have an archetype with monsters that can shut down any aspect of the game, you don't need much, except this time they really did need a lot more. But we'll save the bashing for a little later. 8 monsters, 2 spells, and 1 trap is what the archetype has to its name.
We're under attack. Quick, what should we do, boss?
We only have enough time to send out one message. Quick, let me message this chicken VTuber a chat. Hey, do you like food?
What? Yeah, I like food.
Do you like food, but hate having to make trips to the grocery store and buying all the ingredients for a recipe, only to end up with all kinds of leftover food?
We don't have time for this. Why are you bugging them with questions about food?
Is this a prank?
This is not a joke at all. HelloFresh helps you with meal planning so you can save stress, with 45 plus recipes and even more market items that support your lifestyle. Plus, when you sign up for HelloFresh, you get free dessert for life. Make restaurant-quality meals at home topped off with a decadent sweet treat. Get 1 free dessert item per box while your subscription is active.
So, please stop messing around and call for help.
No more staring blankly at the fridge, wondering what to make for dinner. Give HelloFresh a try and choose from 30 plus calorie smart or protein smart recipes each week. Packed with fresh ingredients, everything arrives pre-portioned and right at your doorstep for less hassle and more And the best part? When you try HelloFresh, you'll unlock free dessert for life. That's right, satisfy your sweet tooth with free dessert items in every box for as long as your subscription is active.
Can someone ban this guy from my chat for self-promo?
Hurry, make a real call. We might still have time.
Thanks to HelloFresh for sponsoring today's video. Go to hellofresh.com/TheDuelLogs, use my code DuelLogs16FM, and receive 16 free meals plus free dessert for life when the subscription is active. Starting with our level 2 monsters, we have Amorphage Gluttony and Amorphage Lechery. There's no need to focus on their cost and continuous effects, as we've already stated what they all have, so we can just focus on their other floodgate effects. Gluttony has 0 attack and 1850 defense, scale 5, and when in the pendulum zone, monsters cannot activate their effects except for Amorphage monsters while you control one. Lechery has 1350 attack and 0 defense with a pendulum scale 5 that stopped both players from activating spells except Amorphage cards. Amorphage Envy, Greed, Pride, and Wrath were the level 4s of the deck. Envy was a pendulum scale 5 that had 0 attack and 2050 defense, with an effect that stopped both players from activating cards and effects, such as a Chainlink 2 or higher. Pride was a scale of 3 with 1750 attack and 0 defense, and stopped both players from taking effect damage. Greed was a scale 3 with 0 attack and 1950 defense, and prevented both players from activating trap cards except Amorphage cards. And Wrath was a scale 3 with 1650 attack and 0 defense that prevented both players from treating cards except for Amorphage monsters. Amorphage Sloth was a level 5 pendulum monster with a scale of 3, 2250 attack and 0 defense. When it's in your pendulum scale, neither player can add cards from their deck to their hand except by drawing them. And finally, Amorphage Goliath is their boss monster with 2750 attack and 0 defense, a scale of 5, and banishes any card sent to the graveyard except for Amorphage monsters. These dragon monsters could lock your opponent out of whatever mechanic you can imagine with these cards that had the ability to become any floodgate in the game, from Imperial Order, Vanity's Emptiness, Royal Decree, heck, even a Mask of Restrict effect based on what monsters you popped into your pendulum zone. Add in the fact they were a dragon type deck and had one of the craziest summoning mechanics in the game of pendulum summoning, and the only place this archetype could go was up, right? Well, unfortunately, no. Although Amorphage's goal was to stop your opponent from playing the game, they also completely stopped themselves from playing as well. Think of them as the Dallas Cowboys of the Yu-Gi-Oh world. having a classic case of shooting themselves in the foot. There are a couple of reasons why this happens, and more than likely, you've figured them out just by what we've said so far in the video. The first reason is the archetype's insane maintenance cost. When your standby phase appears, you must sack a monster to upkeep the pendulum scales you control. Sure, you could use non-Amorphage monsters if you had them, but more than likely, you wouldn't due to needing Amorphage monsters on the field for the floodgate effects, and the fact the deck had so little room to run outside of pendulum monsters without bricking. Amorphage players could run some cards to lessen the toll of tributing monsters by running cards that produce extra monsters as fodder, such as Scapegoat, which you could use at the end of your opponent's turn to get 4 tokens for you to utilize. Scapegoat is probably one of the many techs the deck has used since its creation. It was a solid backup to activate if your monsters were somehow removed from the field during your opponent's turn, since you could flip the card, get your tokens, and sack them as an upkeep during your standby phase. Also, they could utilize a card such as Ties of the Brethren to summon 2 more Amorphage monsters from your deck by paying 2,000 life points, being unable to special summon for the rest of the turn and not conducting your battle phase. They may not be the best options with their summoning restrictions and needing to be played while not having them conflict with your Amorphage flood effects, but they're probably, to this date, the best non-Amorphage techs you can run in almost any circumstance for extra resources to cover the maintenance. The second reason is the fact that the pendulum scales of Amorphages were abysmal. With the lowest scale being 3 and the highest scale being 5, this only allowed you to pendulum summon level 4 Amorphage monsters. Add in the fact the whole archetype was pendulum monsters, you couldn't bring back any non-level 4 monsters from your extra deck, including your ace in the hole, Goliath. This holds the same for them in the spell and trap card zone if they're destroyed. What doesn't help this is that the non-level 4s had the best effects. Gluttony stopped monster effects, and Lechery stopped spells. Sloth was a walking talking mistake, and Goliath was a macros. All of these effects could easily never be seen again due to being destroyed as monsters or spells via maintenance or other destruction effects. So the only way to summon any of these monsters was to sack them on a normal or tribute summon, with the latter costing you resources you need to use for upkeep. The third reason was this deck needed to go first to establish its board, meaning you'd have to put cards in the field, having no idea what your opponent would be playing. A card like Lechery in your Pendulum Zone would be great against most decks that use a high amount of spells. But what would it do against a deck that has a low amount of spells, like Hat, if it ever was caught in that predicament? It wasn't easy to adjust either, for the deck was pretty much in dead water, presented to go second. As always needed to stop the deck was to remove the monsters off the board and your opponent to get rid of the floodgate they think would present the most problems for them. These reasons alone show why Amorphage is one of the most fragile archetypes ever to be printed, if not the most fragile archetype ever to be printed. Already being a restricting deck that barely lets you play text inside of it, you essentially had a deck that could cave in on itself because of its demanding cost, and at the same time lose the resources permanently due to their pendulum scales not supporting certain Amorphage monsters. Surprisingly, one Amorphage monster did see some competitive play. Goliath caught the eyes of Dragon deck players, specifically Blue Eyes. Goliath was honored to be level 8, making it great to dump with trade-in as draw power while also being used in a majority of Blue Eyes end boards, as the deck had no problem making Galaxy Eyes Dark Matter Dragon. By using Dark Matter's trigger effect, the deck could send Goliath and Archbrave Dragon to the grave to not only banish 3 cards from your opponent's deck, but be able to use Archbrave Dragon's effect on your opponent's turn to special summon the Goliath and lock them out of special summoning monsters and daring them to try to climb over a Vanity, Emptiness, and Dragon form. Outside of that, this would be as much word of mouth as you'd hear about Amorphage monsters. This same would go for their spell and trap cards. Amorphage Infection was their continuous spell. All Amorphage monsters gain 100 attack for each Amorphage card on the field. Once per turn, when an Amorphage monster is tributed or destroyed in your hand or on the field, you can add an Amorphage card from your deck to your hand. Their field spell, Amorphous Persona, gave all face-up Amorphage monsters 300 attack and defense. Up to twice per turn, if an Amorphage monster is tributed, you get to draw 1 card. You can also banish this card from the graveyard to ritual summon 1 Amorphactor Pain, the Imagination Trigger Overlord, from your hand by tributing pendulum monsters whose levels are equal to or exceed 8 from your hand or field. Infection added much needed search power to the deck. It's an Amorphage card that helps the archetype retrieve resources from the deck while preventing it from being hindered by Sloth's effect, which prevents players from adding cards to their hand except by drawing them. It could also search the spells and traps, including another copy of itself. This is about as good as the Melty Dragon's got. Amorphous Persona, however, wasn't as impactful. The first mistake was the fact that this card didn't have Amorphage in its name, making it basically unsearchable in the archetype and needing to be set up first before you play a card like Amorphage Lechery, which locks out all spells that aren't Amorphage. If you're wondering what all this ritual summon commotion is about, we can give you a clue. Amorphactor Pain, the Imagination Dragon Overlord, was a level 8 Earth Dragon ritual monster with 2950 attack and 2500 defense. When ritual summoned, your opponent's main phase 1 is skipped on their next turn. It negates the effects of all Synchro, Fusion, and Xyz monsters while they're on the field, and when this card is sent to the graveyard, you can add a Draco Overlord card from your deck to your hand. If you think this was a random splash for the archetype, you're 100% correct. This card was likely added for an ongoing lore story involving Draco Slayers, Amorphages, and Draco Overlords. This card suffered the same issues that Persona has, such as being unsearchable and a card without the Amorphage name, making it hard to summon the card. Sacrificing Amorphages for a ritual summon ran a chance of turning off one of your floodgate effects as well. Also, the searching effect for the Draco Overlord monsters rarely came to fruition, and you can probably guess why. The deck couldn't afford to run a brick and a Morphactor, so it definitely had no benefit in running another non-archetype pendulum. However, with the deck needing as much draw and search power as possible, Persona was almost a guaranteed automatic in the deck, getting you at least 2 new cards if you tributed Amorphage monsters. The final piece of support was their trap card, Amorphage Lysis. This continuous trap card decreased the attack and defense of all non-Amorphage monsters in the field by 100 for each Amorphage card you control. Once per turn, if a pendulum monster is destroyed in your pendulum zone, you can take an Amorphage monster from your deck and place it in your pendulum zone. Though it was a continuous trap, it was a fantastic way to guarantee that your pendulum zones would always have a body if something went awry and you lost a skill. Now, before you get the idea of, oh wait, I could just not pay the cost of X Amorphage and just play another copy from your deck into the pendulum zone, we're here to say that the world of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is never that simple. No matter if it's newly placed in the pendulum zone, at any time during your standby phase, you must pay the maintenance cost. There's no way to get around it, even if that pendulum monster's effect is negated for whatever reason. So as long as it's your standby phase, even if it just got placed in the pendulum zone, you're either losing a monster in the field or a monster in the spell and trap card zone. Overall, Lysis was more of an insurance card if your opponent somehow got to your back row and made it easier for your monsters to punch over your opponent's monsters. Outside of the spell and trap card support, having the ability to replenish your resources and lessen the stress of the maintenance costs, they all helped in one important aspect: strengthening your Amorphage's attack and defense power. With your highest monster's base attack maxed out at 2750, your lowest at 0, and the deck's playstyle being a grind fest and floodgates, the deck needed cards to either make them high attack powerhouses or impenetrable walls that are tough for your opponent to get over. Unfortunately, with the deck being a fragile, self-depleting, draconic mess, this plan could only hold up until it imploded. The deck was clearly a first turn deck with a linear playstyle and had no way to adjust its board outside of playing the appropriate Amorphage, which was on a wing and a prayer if your opponent didn't remove it when you activated it. The 2016 meta just had quicker decks, like Cosmo, decks that pump out powerful monsters like Blue Eyes, decks that spam the board quickly like BA, and decks that didn't care about special summoning like Monarchs. This deck had too many holes and cracks that other decks could operate around. It also didn't become easier for the deck as time went along. Power creep hit this deck immediately, and not even by the next year was this deck popped back into the Yu-Gi-Oh! Binders. Only one card released in 2020 in Rise of the Duelists we see as Amorphage support, but it wasn't even an Amorphage card. Odd Eyes Revolution Dragon was a level 12 Pendulum Dragon whose Pendulum skill was 12. Its Pendulum effect was a non-negotiable clause that locked you into being only able to Pendulum summon dragons. As for its monster effect, the only effect you would use it for is its ability to add a Pendulum Dragon monster from your deck to your hand by discarding it and paying 500 life points. This made it the best free searcher in the deck without having to meet the requirement of Amorphage Infection just to search for a monster. Also, it being a 12 scale made it now possible to summon your Sloth and Goliath via pendulum summoning. The only issue was the release of this card, as it was introduced in the TCG 3 years after its OCG release in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc 5 promotional pack. By the time the deck needed this, it was already a different format with even faster decks with playstyles that thwarted any chance of this deck escaping power creep. It's unbelievable to hear that a pendulum-based dragon deck failed to be playable. Okay, there's Odd Eyes and Zark, but those failures can be more acquainted with Konami's affection for anti-spell fragrance being an automatic win condition. When facing off against Amorphage, it doesn't take much for anyone to beat this deck. Weird stats, heavy maintenance costs, constrictive space inside the deck, and horrible at pendulum summoning are great signs of making life for your opponent a breeze. The worst part is the fact that this might be all the Amorphages get. The last thing a Yu-Gi-Oh! Meta needs in this day and age, where you can play a deck that puts 5+ interruptions on the board, is a Dragon Pendulum deck that has every floodgate known to man printed on them, and can seal your opponent out of their extra deck to reappear. The TCG already has such a major love-hate relationship with floodgates that making more support for a deck whose sole purpose is to slow the game down to such a simple state isn't the greatest of ideas. For right now, Amorphages is in the right place, and that's staying in 2016. Being lore food and a non-factor in the TCG. A first turn-based deck that takes an arm and a leg to upkeep non-stop and has to play a guessing game on which floodgates would stop their opponent isn't a well thought out plan for success. Amorphages can roar their terrible scales into the TheDuelLogs Hall of Fail.